Two police officers thought they could harass a black man sitting in the park. Minutes later, they realized they had just assaulted a high-ranking U.S. Army general, and it was already too late to undo their mistake. The park was bustling with life. Families strolled along the winding paths. Children laughed as they chased each other across the green fields, and joggers weaved through the crowds, their earbuds in, lost in their own worlds. The morning sun bathed everything in a golden hue, casting long shadows over the benches where people sat, sipping coffee, reading newspapers, or simply enjoying the crisp air. Among them, a black man sat alone on a weathered wooden bench near a fountain. His presence was quiet, unassuming, yet there was something about him that felt distinct. His posture was too straight, his gaze too steady, his breathing too controlled. He wasn't just another man idly passing time. There was an air of discipline about him, a silent authority that was easy to overlook, but impossible to ignore once noticed. A child's red ball rolled toward him, bouncing softly against his polished black boots. The boy, no older than 6, hesitated for a second before approaching. The man bent down, picking up the ball with slow, deliberate movements. He turned it in his hands, feeling its texture, before handing it back to the child with a small nod. "Thank you, sir," the boy mumbled, eyes wide. The man's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. Before the boy could linger, his mother rushed over, grabbing his wrist. "Come along, honey," she said quickly, pulling him away. Her eyes darted to the man for a split second, wary, assessing, before she turned her back and walked off, her grip on her son a little too tight. The man exhaled slowly. He was used to it. Nearby, an elderly gentleman sitting on another bench squinted in his direction. There was recognition in his eyes, a flicker of something more. Respect, perhaps. His mouth opened slightly, as if he was about to speak, but before he could, a sharp, jarring sound cut through the morning air. A police siren. Heads turned as a patrol car rolled onto the park's gravel path, its tires crunching against the loose stones. 2 white officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp, their expressions already set with authority. They scanned the area before locking eyes on the man on the bench. Their interest was immediate. The older officer, a burly man with a thick mustache, nudged his younger partner, a tall, eager-looking recruit who still had the nervous energy of someone trying to prove himself. Together, they walked toward the man, their hands resting on their belts, the weight of their badges heavy on their chests. The joggers kept jogging. The families kept walking. The children kept playing. But some people noticed. A woman sitting nearby lowered her phone, her brows furrowing slightly. The elderly man on the bench straightened, his grip tightening on his cane. The black man on the bench? He didn't move. He simply waited. The crunch of boots on gravel grew louder as the 2 officers closed the distance. The black man remained seated, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady. He had felt their eyes on him from the moment they stepped out of the patrol car. This wasn't the first time, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. The older officer, his badge glinting under the sunlight, was the first to speak. "Sir, we need to see some identification." The man's expression didn't change. He didn't reach for his wallet, nor did he respond immediately. Instead, he let the words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken tension. The younger officer shifted on his feet, glancing at his partner before adding, "We got a call about a suspicious individual loitering here for too long." His voice carried a rehearsed confidence, the kind that came from knowing the badge on his chest gave him power. The man finally looked up. His gaze moved between the 2 officers, slow and deliberate, as if measuring them, weighing something invisible. Then, with a calm that made the silence between them even sharper. He spoke. "A call?" His voice was deep, steady. "Or just a hunch?" The older officer's jaw tightened. "I don't like your tone. And I don't like being harassed." A few people nearby had stopped walking. They weren't intervening, but they were watching. Phones had started to appear, held low, recording discreetly. The older officer took a step forward, his presence looming. "This isn't harassment. It's a routine check. You're sitting here alone, watching people. Makes some folks uncomfortable." The man's expression remained unreadable. "Sitting on a bench is suspicious now." The younger officer scoffed, trying to regain control of the situation. "Look, just show us your ID, and we won't have a problem." The man didn't move. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words. The older officer exhaled sharply, patience wearing thin. "Stand up." Still, the man didn't move. "I said stand up." The officer reached down, grabbing the man's arm. And in that moment, the atmosphere in the park shifted. It wasn't the act of grabbing him. It was what happened next. The man didn't jerk away. He didn't resist. He simply stood. But he did so with such controlled precision that the officer instinctively released his grip, as if he had touched something he wasn't supposed to. The man's full height became apparent. He wasn't just tall. He carried himself in a way that made him seem even taller. His shoulders squared, his back straightened, and for the first time, the officers hesitated. He wasn't afraid, and that made them nervous. The older officer recovered quickly, masking his unease with arrogance. "Turn around, hands where I can see them." A shift ran through the onlookers. Whispers spread. This wasn't right, and everyone knew it. Then, the man moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket. The younger officer's hand flew to his holster, fingers grazing the handle of his gun. The crowd inhaled collectively. But instead of a weapon, the man pulled out a small leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a gleaming ID card, worn at the edges, but unmistakable in its authority. 4 stars. The older officer's eyes narrowed, his irritation turning into confusion. The younger officer leaned in slightly, squinting at the ID before his face drained of color. "Wait," he muttered under his breath. The older officer's frown deepened. His mouth opened, then closed, as if his brain was struggling to process what he was looking at. A murmur spread through the crowd. A few people recognized the insignia. A few gasps escaped. The elderly man on the nearby bench, who had been watching everything unfold, finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, but firm. "General." The weight of the word hit like a gunshot. For a moment, everything stood still. The word general hung in the air like an unseen force pressing down on the officers. The older cop blinked, his face twisting between skepticism and sudden creeping realization. The younger one took a half-step back, eyes flickering between the ID and the man standing before him. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A few people were now openly recording, their phones no longer held low, but raised to capture every detail. But the man, General Elijah Carter, did not flinch. He did not speak. He simply watched. The older officer exhaled sharply, attempting to reclaim control. This could be fake," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his gaze locked onto the man in front of him. "Then call it in," he said evenly. "Verify it." The challenge was simple, direct. The younger officer hesitated, his fingers twitching toward his radio. His training told him to follow protocol, to check identification when there was doubt. But something in the way the general carried himself, something in the stillness of the moment, made him hesitate. The older cop, unwilling to back down, made the decision for him. He snatched the ID from Elijah's hand, squinting at it, fingers gripping the worn leather a little too tightly. "That won't be necessary," he said, shoving the wallet back into Elijah's chest. The gesture wasn't violent, but it was deliberate, a final attempt to assert dominance. Elijah didn't react, but the crowd did. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the bystanders. A woman muttered, "Oh, they're in trouble now." The elderly man on the bench leaned forward, his cane tapping against the pavement. His eyes, sharp despite his age, studied the officers. "You boys have no idea what you've just done, do you?" he said, his voice carrying through the tension. The older cop scoffed. "Mind your business, old man." Elijah's jaw tightened, just slightly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But for the first time, something resembling irritation flickered in his eyes. The younger officer, now visibly unsettled, shifted uncomfortably. "Look," he said quickly, glancing between his partner and Elijah. Maybe there was a misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding," Elijah interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. The weight of those 4 words was undeniable. A few feet away, a jogger in a gray hoodie pulled out his phone and started dialing. "Yeah, I think you should send someone down here," he said into the receiver. "There's about to be a problem." The older cop heard it, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Enough of this," he snapped. "You're causing a disturbance." Elijah arched an eyebrow. "I'm causing a disturbance?" The officer's face flushed red. "You're refusing to cooperate." "I showed you my ID," Elijah said evenly. "That wasn't enough. I told you to verify it. You refused." His gaze didn't waver. "So tell me, officer, what exactly do you want?" It was a question the cop couldn't answer. The younger officer swallowed hard. "Sir, maybe we should just—" But the older one wasn't listening. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. The cameras, the murmuring crowd, the old man's knowing stare, all of it was pressing in on him. His grip on his belt tightened. And then, he made the worst decision of his life. He reached out again. Not a shove this time, not an act of intimidation. This time, he grabbed Elijah Carter's wrist. It happened too fast for anyone to stop it. The moment his fingers closed around the general's arm, everything changed. Elijah moved, not violently, not aggressively, but with absolute controlled precision. In a single fluid motion, he twisted his wrist, breaking the officer's grip effortlessly. His other hand came up, pressing lightly against the cop's chest. Not a push, but a calculated shift in balance. The officer stumbled backward. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't even resistance. It was simply a demonstration of who he was. The crowd erupted. "Oh, damn!" someone gasped. "Did you see that? He didn't even try. He just moved." The older officer, now visibly shaken, scrambled to regain control. His hand flew to his radio. "I need backup at—" A new voice cut through. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." It wasn't Elijah. It was the elderly man. For the first time, the officers looked at him properly, looked at his face, looked at the small pin on his lapel, and then it clicked. The old man wasn't just anyone. He was retired military, and he knew exactly who Elijah Carter was. The officer hesitated, his finger hovering over the radio button. The old man smiled, cold, knowing. "Son," he said, his voice steady, "you just put your hands on a 4-star general of the United States Army." The younger cop's face drained of color. The older one froze. And just like that, he knew. He had just made the worst mistake of his career. A heavy silence fell over the park. The older officer's hand was still on his radio, but he didn't press the button. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe. The weight of the old man's words had landed like a hammer, shattering whatever illusion of control he thought he had. Elijah Carter stood unmoving, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable. He had given them every opportunity to stop, every chance to walk away. And yet, here they were. The younger officer swallowed hard. His lips parted, but no words came out. The crowd, once cautious whispers, had grown into something else entirely. Some were murmuring in disbelief, others shaking their heads in silent judgment. A few had stepped closer, their phones still recording. The older officer finally found his voice. It wasn't as strong as before. This is... He trailed off, eyes darting between Elijah and the old man. This is some kind of joke. The old man chuckled. It wasn't a friendly sound. Son, does it look like he's joking? Elijah reached into his pocket again, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out another ID. This one wasn't just military. It was his official Department of Defense identification, complete with security clearance levels. The moment it came into view, the younger officer's breath hitched. His eyes darted across the credentials, scanning the unmistakable seals and insignias. Jesus Christ, he whispered. The older officer took a step back. He wasn't looking at the ID anymore. He was looking at Elijah, looking at the way he stood, looking at the calm, unshakable presence that he had mistaken for arrogance. This man wasn't just some veteran. He wasn't just some officer. He was a 4-star general. Elijah let the silence stretch, let them feel the weight of their mistake. Then, when he finally spoke, his voice was like steel wrapped in velvet. You wanted my ID, he said, holding it up. You wanted proof. Now you have it. The older officer's lips parted, but no sound came out. His eyes flickered to his partner, but the younger man had already stepped back, as if putting distance between himself and the disaster unfolding. Elijah lowered the ID, slipping it back into his pocket. Now, he continued, voice steady, you have a choice. The officers tensed. You can try to justify what you just did, Elijah said, his gaze locked onto the older officer. You can spin it however you like, but we both know how that will end. The older officer's breathing had grown shallow. Or, Elijah said, you can own your mistake. The tension in the air was suffocating. The older officer's fingers twitched at his side. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to not having the upper hand. But before he could speak, a new sound interrupted. Sirens. More patrol cars. The crowd parted as another set of officers approached. Only this time, they weren't responding to his call for backup. They were responding to the civilians who had witnessed everything. One of them, a senior-ranking officer, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the scene before landing on Elijah. The moment recognition hit, his entire demeanor shifted. General Carter, he said, his voice tight with barely restrained disbelief. What the hell is going on here? Elijah didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because at that moment, the senior officer turned to his subordinates, the same two men who had humiliated themselves in front of an entire park, and his face darkened. You two, he snapped. My office, now. The older officer stiffened. But sir, I wasn't asking, the senior officer growled. The younger cop exhaled sharply, as if finally released from whatever spell had kept him frozen. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the patrol car, his face pale. The older officer lingered for a second longer. His gaze flickered back to Elijah, filled with something that resembled shame, but was too twisted by ego to fully become it. Then, he turned and followed. As they disappeared into the patrol car, the tension in the park slowly dissipated. The crowd remained, still watching, still recording. But the atmosphere had changed. Elijah Carter exhaled through his nose. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply turned to the senior officer and said, "Make sure it doesn't happen again." And with that, he walked away. The park was still buzzing with murmurs, but the energy had shifted. The two disgraced officers had been escorted away, their once confident strides reduced to stiff, reluctant steps. The weight of their mistake was sinking in, and they knew. This wasn't something they could brush under the rug. Not this time. The senior officer turned back to Elijah, his face tight with embarrassment. "General Carter, Elijah raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No need," he said calmly. "I know how this goes." The older man hesitated. "They'll be dealt with," he assured, his voice firmer now. "This department doesn't tolerate this kind of behavior." Elijah gave a small nod, though his expression remained unreadable. He had heard those words before. He had seen these situations play out too many times. Words were easy. Consequences were harder. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the elderly man still sitting on his bench, watching with quiet amusement. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Elijah allowed himself the faintest ghost of a smile. "You knew," Elijah said, stepping closer. The old man chuckled, tapping his cane against the pavement. "Son, I served under General Davis in Nam. I know a soldier when I see one." His eyes gleamed, especially a leader. Elijah nodded in quiet acknowledgement, then turned toward the crowd. Some people looked away, ashamed of their earlier silence. Others stared with something close to admiration. A few had their phones still raised, capturing his every movement. He didn't linger. He didn't need to. Without another word, he adjusted the sleeves of his jacket and walked toward the park exit. Each step was steady, measured, the same way he had walked onto battlefields in foreign lands. The lesson had been delivered. Justice had played out in real time. And as for those officers, they had just learned the hard way. Some mistakes can't be undone. The park returned to its usual rhythm. Children laughed, joggers ran, and the breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass. But something had changed. The people who had witnessed what happened, those who had stood by, uncertain at first, would remember this moment. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve as they watched Elijah Carter disappear down the path. "Mom, who was that man?" The woman hesitated. She had been one of the many who had simply watched, unsure whether to step in or stay silent. Now, her voice was softer, more thoughtful. "A soldier," she said. "A leader." The boy squinted after him. "A hero?" The woman exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, a hero." Somewhere in an office across town, two officers sat in silence, knowing their careers would never be the same. No words could undo what had happened. No excuses could erase the footage spreading across social media like wildfire. They had made a mistake, not just by profiling a man, but by underestimating the wrong man. Elijah Carter didn't need revenge. He didn't need to raise his voice, throw a punch, or demand justice. He let the truth do the work for him. And sometimes, that's the most powerful weapon of all. What do you think? Should those officers face more consequences, or was their public humiliation enough? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, stories that make you think, stories that reveal the truth, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes, the best way to fight injustice is to expose it.